Very good afternoon, everyone. Privyet, and welcome to our deep dive on Rachmaninoff's wonderful all-night vigil, otherwise known as the Vespers. Thanks so much for joining me this afternoon, everyone. So it's a non-singing session today. I'm absolutely in the middle, almost exactly in the middle of the SIC Summer School in this wonderful Russian Wonders Week. And so I thought today, rather than singing, given my voice has to last to the end of the week, I thought instead we would just have a really good deep dive into this wonderful, wonderful music. And as always, we're going to be talking, well, in order to dive, I feel, into a composer's music, we have to find out a bit more about the person themselves. And so today we're going to talk about Mr. Rachmaninoff, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and his life, everything that led up to the creation of the Vespers, and a little bit about what followed. They say a composer, an author, an artist must write from the heart, from their own experiences. Well, when you hear about Rachmaninoff's life, I'm sure you'll agree there are very good reasons why his musical style is so bittersweet, so beautiful, so poignant. So thank you so much for being here, everyone. Now, what we're going to do, I'm just going to very quickly check that the sound files and everything I've got sorted out here is ready to go, and then I shall have a good old chat with you. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Now, if you are here but you're not in the comments, a very, very good afternoon to you. Special hellos, as always, to my friends Anne and her friend Linda. Hello to dear Val and to Kit Kat. Hello to Helen and Bill. Hello to Sue and Tony, to Katie, to Maureen and Sally and Annie and everyone else watching but not in the comments today. Thank you for being here. If you're watching us later on, thank you ever so much for watching. Don't forget, folks, to give us a thumbs up, give us a like if you like what we do, and to hit the subscribe button. There's no charge for being in Homechoir, though if you do want to help us out, you can leave us a tip, or you can join our Patreon, both of which are really, really essential to keeping the lights on and keeping this channel running. So thank you to everyone who is a supporter of ours. And so let me just double check this, the sound and so on before I say hello to everyone. But it's lovely to see you all having a lovely chat in the comments. So first of all, here's a little bit of here's some bells. More on these later on. Here is a tiny bit of a beautiful trio. I know it's quiet. It's supposed to be. Oh, just those chords. Absolutely. When you know you're in Rachmaninoff territory when you've got this. Oh, absolutely, so wonderful. And just to double check the various files I've got, so here's a little bit of the Nunc Dimittis. And here is the start of this video I've got of the Rach Vespers. Now, this isn't the Rach Vespers. This is the introductory bit. But just to check it's running, and back to the chat. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Everything's working. That's such a relief. Oh, I also just need to double check you can see my presentation. So that all seems to be fine. Great stuff. Well then, how is everyone doing? Lisa says, thank goodness for no singing. I'm on catch up and feel like I'm falling behind. I'd hate for anyone to feel like they're falling behind. And so, Lisa, it's my great pleasure to not be singing for you today. And I do hope you enjoy this. I mean, Rachmaninoff's music, oh my goodness me, it is such a... And you'll understand more about it once you hear about his life. But, you know, everyone has struggle in their lives. And Rachmaninoff's music just has this... You feel the struggle that the man went through. You feel every note. It comes from a place of understanding of what it is to be a person, what it is to feel pain in one's life, and what it is to overcome that pain and to move forward despite everything. I mean, that is really the story of Rachmaninoff's life. So we'll be talking about that in more detail. But Let's have a little look. So many of you here live today. How wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. I do hope you're having a nice day. And if I just have a look at the participants now, this isn't a comprehensive list. This is just those people who've commented in the last few minutes. I can say hello to everyone. So hello to Ati, hello to Alison and to Barbara. Hello, Breda, Goodnab and Carla. Hello to Carol and Bumble. Hello to Carolyn. Hello to Christine and Malcolm. Hello to Dave and Jill. Hello, Diane. Good morning, Dorothy. Hello, Eileen. Hello, Liz. Hello, Anna. Hello, Irina. Good afternoon. Is it good evening, Jill? I hope your neighbours have calmed down a bit. Hello to Jill. Hello to dear Judith. Great to see you. Good morning, Julie. Hello to Jean. And a couple more people have joined on. So hello to Carolyn as well. Hello to Kareth and Lisa, and to Michael and Mike. Hello, Nikki and Ruth. Great to hear that Matthew's back at school, Ruth. That's lovely. Hello to Shan. Hello to Susanna and to Hanu. Hello to Suzanne. Bonjour. All right, Terry. And hello to Virginia. And anyone else who's joined us in the last few minutes. A quick scan down the list. I see Karen's here. Hello, Karen. And everyone else. Wonderful. Thanks ever so much for being here, folks. Carla's talking about a Banksy expedition. Or exhibition, I should say. Need to get new eyes. Fabulous. Well, we're going to start, folks. As I've said, this is a non-singing session. This is just a deep dive. So it'll be me talking about this wonderful music, sharing some of it with you, and hopefully, introducing some new ideas and some new themes to you. If you know Rachmaninoff's music, if you've experienced any of it, his piano music is so sublime, his symphonies, his piano concertos, or even if you do know the Vespers, I think today's session is going to be of great interest to you. As I've said already, though, if you wouldn't mind giving us a like and subscribing if you haven't done so, that would be wonderful. Hello, Glennis. Lovely to see you. Hello to Patrick and Judith. I can't miss Glennis shouting in all caps. Great to see you. Well, look, we're going to get started, everyone. Please do keep chatting now. I'm going to actually pop your comments out, and I'm going to put them here below my presentation so I can scan them. Usually when I'm singing, I do pop your comments over to one side so that all the chat about what's going on in people's lives doesn't necessarily get picked up desperately quickly, but I will keep an eye on the comments if you have any burning questions as we go, ladies and gentlemen. So do please enjoy today's session. Sit back, relax, make sure you've got a drink. I've got my iced coffee, and the ice doesn't seem to be melting as quickly as it did yesterday, which is always good. So do please enjoy. So here we go, everyone, and we're going to start. So let's have our presentation up on screen. Right, everyone. So welcome to the second in our series Exploring the Great Works with me, Ben England. And last week we looked at Mozart's Requiem, an amazing work. Well, this week's work is no less wonderful, no less amazing, and no less powerful in terms of its emotional impact. Rachmaninoff is an incredible character. Is known, I think, for a number of different aspects to his life. If you mention Rachmaninoff, a lot of people might start humming a tune, do 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 do, or perhaps one of the piano concertos or so on. He's obviously well known as a composer. He was also a very prominent conductor of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he was also an amazing pianist. And one of the things you'll know is that he had enormous hands. He could span a 13th, which is like that. He had the most enormous hands. And so this had a huge impact on his compositional style and everything else. But before we get into the discussion of the music itself, I always feel when we're learning about a great work, it's vital to know as much as we can about the person who produced it, whether that is a composer, whether it's an artist, whether it is an author, because art doesn't just appear from nowhere. It's not like somebody wakes up in the morning and goes, oh, well, it's a symphony, boom, and writes it down, unless perhaps you're Mozart. But even there, the emotional baggage that we all carry through life will imprint itself on whatever it is we do. And Rachmaninoff is one of those composers who struggled throughout his life with tragedy, and overcame a lot of aspects of his personality and a lot of aspects of being a person, really, that I think makes him one of the most human and really a very sympathetic figure. So let's start at the beginning with the man himself. Here he is, Sergei Rachmaninoff, who was born in 1873 and died in 1943. He was born into an aristocratic family. The family tradition claims descent from a legendary Vasily, that is to say, a royal. And Vasily, by the way, is the origin of the name Basil, just so you know. And this particular Vasily was nicknamed Rachmanin, which means lazy in Old Russian. And this Vasily was apparently a grandson of Stephen III of Moldova. Now, what I love is, of course, Sergei is George in English. And if Rachmanin is lazy, or he who bees lazy, then he's George Lazenby, ladies and gentlemen. So anyway, so he was born into this aristocratic family, and his family themselves were quite well off, at least in the beginning. Rachmaninoff's mother, part of her dowry included 5 substantial estates, and when she married Rachmaninoff's father, Vasily Rachmaninoff, who was a military officer, they had 5 children, and Rachmaninoff grew up on one of these wonderful estates. Now, interestingly, the musical tradition was very strong in Rachmaninoff's family. His paternal grandfather took music lessons from the Irish composer John Field. Now, you may not have heard of John Field, but if you know of Chopin's mazurkas and his nocturnes and so on, John Field is a very prominent composer of the 19th century, and he produced wonderful nocturnes, wonderful piano pieces that stand alongside the works of Chopin, Liszt, and those great romantic pianists. And so the tendency, I think, ran through the family to write beautiful melodies, to write beautiful pieces for the piano. Now, Rachmaninoff began piano and music lessons when he was a young lad. He was only 4. Rachmaninoff's mother noted the young Sergei's ability to reproduce tunes, to reproduce entire pieces, in fact, and not get a single note wrong. And that is obviously quite a substantial gift. So upon noticing this, it was suggested that she hire a lady called Anna Ornatskaya, who was a recent graduate from the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and she was hired to live in with the family and to teach the young Sergei piano and basically begin his formal musical teaching. Now, later in life, Rachmaninoff dedicated his piano work, Spring Waters from the 12 Romances, to Ornatskaya. It's very clear he had great affection from this lady who taught him music from a very early age. Now, unfortunately, despite a rather nice start to his life, things didn't go all as planned. And Rachmaninoff's father wasn't very good with money. And this is a theme that you see in many great composers' lives. Beethoven was another one of these, where the father is a bit of a drunkard, a bit of a womanizer, and not very good with money. And so throughout Rachmaninoff's childhood, what you see is that this great series of estates, 5 great estates, was being auctioned off until they were just reduced to a single plot of land with a single house. And I mean, this is very much part of Rachmaninoff's upbringing. He was very critical of his father later in life. Throughout his life, he described him as a wastrel, a compulsive gambler, a pathological liar, and a skirt chaser. So not exactly the world's greatest epitaph, but there you are. Now, the family was forced to move to a small flat in St. Petersburg, having previously been this grand family with all of this land. Well, this is by the time Rachmaninoff is barely 10. And so they moved to a small flat, as I say, in St. Petersburg. In 1883, Ornatskaya arranged for Rachmaninoff, this is the young Sergei, I should say, to study music at the conservatory. So obviously he was very, very talented. Now, very sadly, later that year, his sister Sophia died of diphtheria, and his father left the family and moved to Moscow. And in those days, I mean, that would have meant certain financial ruin, penury, early death for everybody involved. But Rachmaninoff's maternal grandmother stepped in, bearing in mind that his mother's family was the relatively wealthy part of his life, and so she stepped in to support the family financially and spiritually. And so she regularly took the young Sergei off to Russian Orthodox church services, and here is where we start to see the first seeds planted of what would then become the Vespers later on. And this is where he first experienced these liturgical chants and vitally church bells. And these are 2 features that would feature throughout his future compositions, not just the Vespers, but his first symphony is just is absolutely riven through with wonderful, wonderful church melodies. And what you've got to remember, of course, is we have the facility these days to just listen to any piece of music we like, very much at the touch of a button. But in those days, still pretty much before recorded sound, the bells in your town, in your city, were some of the only times you would be able to regularly hear music, and they would play a lot. And so let's have a little listen to the bells of the Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul in St. Petersburg. And this is one of the finest Baroque buildings in the city. It was built between 1712 and 1733. It was a big, bold statement of Peter the Great, who was at the time, he had a desire to adopt Western European styles in architecture and in religion. And listen to the melodic line that these bells create. I mean, just those of you who've been singing the Rachmaninoff, both here on Homechoir, where we learned Bogorodice Dievo, and also with SIC this week, just follow the melodic line with your ears and you'll really hear the origins of a lot of these lovely tunes. Here we go. There we are. So, these bells would play all day, every day, and really these tunes became part of Rachmaninoff's musical upbringing as a boy. And as I've said, he later in life, he wrote an incredible piece called The Bells, which I would love to conduct one day, which was all about this exactly. So the young Rachmaninoff was at conservatory, but further tragedy struck in 1885 when he was only 12. His beloved older sister Yelena died of pernicious anemia. Now, she was a vital figure in Rachmaninoff's life, not only as his big sister, but also as the person who introduced the young Sergei to the music of Tchaikovsky. And Tchaikovsky was at the time, the absolute pillar of Russian music, about as popular as a composer has ever been in Russia. Now, this obviously had a huge impact on the young lad, and very unfortunately, his studies at the conservatory started to slip. It said he took a more relaxed attitude to his classes and he failed his general education. There was no problem with his piano, with his music, but the general education, I'm afraid, started to slip. And he got caught fiddling his report cards. Okay, he falsified his report cards in what the composer Rimsky-Korsakov later called a period of purely Russian self-delusion and laziness, which I think is lovely. And if you remember, of course, that Rachmaninoff comes from Rachmanin, meaning lazy, perhaps there was a little bit of fate there. Now, alongside this decline in his academic studies, he was also performing, however, as a very successful pianist at the Moscow Conservatory. And during this time, he was entertaining Grand Dukes and other notable figures and figures of royalty. So whilst his general studies were declining, his music was very strong. And on failing his spring exams, Ornetsky, I remember his early piano teacher, told his mother that his admission to further education might not carry on. It might be revoked. Now, this was obviously of great concern to his mother. So his mother then consulted with Alexander Silotti, her nephew, and an accomplished musician in his own right, a pupil of Franz Liszt. And this, on the left, is Mr. Silotti. And he recommended that Sergei be transferred to the Moscow Conservatory. Okay, so up to the big leagues, everyone, and receive lessons from his former teacher, the more strict Nikolai Zverev, okay, who was a real stickler, basically taught with the rod. And this lasted till 1888. Sergei did indeed move to Moscow and move to the conservatory there. It turns out what he needed was a bit of discipline, and so his studies then picked up again. Now, from 1885 to 1893, the young Rachmaninoff grew in experience and confidence. He lived with his piano teacher Zverev in Moscow for 4 years, and during that he met and befriended the young Scriabin, who was a fellow piano pupil as well. Now, after 2 years of hard work and graft and probably quite a few rapped knuckles, he was awarded a prestigious scholarship and began study of the advanced techniques of piano. He spent his summer break in 1819 here in Ivanovka which was a private estate, which he returned to for many, many years until 1917. And we'll talk more about 1917 here a bit later on. He wrote a great deal of his early music here at Ivanovka, including his Piano Concerto No. 1. So this is where things start to both take off and also drop off for Paul Rachmaninoff. Now, this gentleman here to my left is Tchaikovsky. And in 1892, Rachmaninoff put on his first independent concert, which he organised, and it was very successful, which led to his first commission, which was a one-act opera called Aleko. And Aleko was hugely successful. One thing I do need to say before we talk about the opera is that he wrote it in 17 days. And this is the first time you sort of hear of this, incredible productivity. But this is a feature of Rachmaninoff's compositional style. When he was in the zone, if you like, he would work solidly until the piece was completed, unlike some composers who toil for years over a single work. And when you hear about the Vespers, when you hear about subsequent pieces, you hear that he wrote it in a week, he wrote it in 2 weeks, he wrote it in 3 weeks. And so Aleko was produced during a period of extreme productivity. And it was, as I say, highly successful. The premiere was attended by Tchaikovsky, who came up to him afterwards and praised his work. Now, you can imagine, as somebody who's venerated and worshipped this composer throughout his life, to have him at the first performance and to receive such praise was hugely, hugely important to him. Now, Aleko wasn't just important for personal reasons, for professional reasons as well. It was vital to Rachmaninoff's development. It got him the highest mark possible at the conservatory. He was still studying at the time. He was also awarded the Great Gold Medal of the Conservatory, which had only been previously awarded twice before in the whole history of the institution. Now, this allowed Rachmaninoff to graduate with distinction. He got his diploma. He was therefore able to style himself as a free artist, as a professional musician, and begin work. So it's a vital, vital step, this Aleko. It also, by the way, was being performed at this theatre in Moscow, and it generated a regular income for him, which of course is vital for musicians. Now, in 1893, just a year later, whilst in Kiev to conduct a performance of Aleko, Rachmaninoff heard of Tchaikovsky's death from cholera. Now, this news completely blindsided him and left him absolutely stunned. Later that day, he began work on a beautiful piece, the Trio Elegiac for piano, violin, and cello. He wrote it in just 2 days. Again, one of these brief periods of productivity, and it remains one of his most emotive and deeply gloomy works. And you can really hear the grief for his idol. And we'll listen to a few bars here. You hear the fluttering. It's very quiet, by the way. Those of you listening on external speakers, you might need to listen closely. You hear a sort of fluttering of strings, which seems to shift time signature before the piano comes in with that beautiful G minor tonality. So here is just a little bit of the Trio Elegiac composed for Tchaikovsky on hearing of his death. Here we are. So distinctively Rachmaninoff. Those wonderful, wonderful chords. Diminished chords over a minor chord. It's just so evocative and so typical. You can hear, as I say, the grief, almost hear the catching of the breath as he hears the news of his idol's passing. So, so very sad. And so much tragedy in the man's life. Following Tchaikovsky's death, and this is a photo taken that same year, Rachmaninoff went into a bit of a decline. He lacked the inspiration to compose. The theatre where Aleko was being performed pulled the opera. It had been playing for years, and so they decided not to produce it anymore, to do something new, which of course hit Rachmaninoff's income quite significantly. So to earn more money, Rachmaninoff was, in his own words, reduced to giving piano lessons. And in late 1895, he agreed to a cross-country tour with an Italian violinist of the name of Teresina Tua. and this, unfortunately, was not a great success. Rachmaninoff didn't enjoy the experience and withdrew about a month into the planned program, which of course meant he forfeited all of the money, sacrificed all of the performance fees. In desperation, he pawned that medal that he'd earned, and again had to take up giving piano lessons. Now, in amongst all of this turmoil and grief, Rachmaninoff was working incredibly hard on his first symphony, his Symphony Number 1, which was conceived in January of that year and was based on chants that he'd heard in the Russian Orthodox Church. Here's another link to the Vespers, which are following shortly. And he'd worked so hard on this, he basically burnt himself out, and he couldn't return to composition until he heard the piece performed. Now, it was performed in 1896, and unfortunately, in the process of rehearsing for this, a rather large sum of money that was not his was stolen from Rachmaninoff during a train journey, which he then had to work to recoup the losses. So a lot of tragedy on top of misfortune, on top of unfortunate events, all piling on top of the composer. Now, his symphony was performed on the 28th of March, 1897. And Rachmaninoff was so nervous that he'd been caught before the performance hiding under a staircase. But the work was performed. Now, very, very sadly, it was panned by critics, in particular this gentleman here, César Cui, who likened it to a depiction of the 10 plagues of Egypt. And this is what he wrote. And I've put a bit of fire on screen because, goodness me, this is a fiery review. If there was a conservatory in hell, and if one of its talented students were to compose a programmed symphony based on the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, and if he were to compose a symphony like Mr. Rachmaninoff's, then he would have fulfilled his task brilliantly and would delight the inhabitants of hell. Now, that was quite a blow, and this was published in all the major newspapers. Now, Rachmaninoff himself didn't enjoy the first performance of his symphony. The conductor, Mr. Glazunov, was an alcoholic, and there's a lot of evidence to say that he did a really terrible job of rehearsing and performing Rachmaninoff's symphony, which, if I'm honest, I really enjoy, but the actual performance was not good. Rachmaninoff said, I felt deeply distressed and heavily depressed by the fact that my symphony did not please me at all after its first rehearsal. And he thought the performance in general was just poor, particularly Glazunov's contribution. So here is where we get to one of the most defining parts of Rachmaninoff's life. In 1898, he fell into a severe depression, which manifested itself in many ways, including complete and total writer's block. As he wrote later on, he said these 4 years were like the man who had suffered a stroke and had lost the use of his head and his hands, and he stopped composing altogether. And this, of course, is before he'd written these wonderful symphonies and piano concertos and so on that we know and love. There was a brief period where he produced a couple of tiny piano works in the middle of this very, very, very down period. But no, he was basically at a loss. Now, his aunt had a suggestion, because by 1900, Rachmaninoff had become so self-critical and so in doubt of his own abilities, he had vowed never to compose again, and he was just going to be a piano teacher. But his aunt gave him an important suggestion, a vital suggestion, to seek help from a family friend and physician called Nikolai Dahl. And Dahl worked with Rachmaninoff between January and April of 1900, and they had daily hypnotherapy and psychotherapy sessions, which worked to improve his mood, to improve his appetite, his sleep patterns, and reignite his desire to compose. And I'm delighted to say, ladies and gentlemen, it worked. Rachmaninoff went back to work and shortly afterwards produced his Piano Concerto No. 2, which is devoted and dedicated to Dahl himself. And one of the things I love about Rachmaninoff, and why it's so important, I think, to put all this work into context, is he is, to my mind, one of the first composers to publicly suffer from depression and to seek therapy and to get through it. And I feel that, knowing that he subsequently produced some of these most astonishing works, his most beloved works, after this period of writer's block and suffering some of the worst losses of his life, is a huge inspiration to me, and I know to many others. And not only was this Piano Concerto No. 2 received well by the public, it also earned him a prestigious award and a lot of money as a prize in 1904. Now, let's move towards the composition of the Vespers themselves. In 1910, Rachmaninoff became vice president of the Imperial Russian Music Society, whose president was a member of the royal family. Now, this is 1910. This is only a few years before the revolution. Rachmaninoff is very much entwined with the royal family, and later in 1910, he produced his first choral work, the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostomum, okay, which some of you might have performed. It's a lovely, lovely piece. It's very much a precursor of the Vespers, but it was banned from performance, unfortunately, because it didn't follow the format of a traditional liturgical church service. Then in 1915, bearing in mind the war by that point was underway, Rachmaninoff completed the all-night vigil, which we know of as the Vespers, after he attended a performance, I should say, of the St. John Chrysostomum and didn't enjoy it. He said he was disappointed with it, so he spent a grand total, ladies and gentlemen, of 2 weeks writing the all-night vigil, another burst of creativity. He passed the score to one of his colleagues, a choral composer of great note called Sergei Tanayev, and this was for him to correct any errors in the harmony and in the score and proofreading and correcting the polyphony. The score was returned unaltered. So that shows you, even though he didn't write an awful lot of choral music, what Rachmaninoff did write was perfect. Now, this piece was received so warmly at its Moscow premiere in aid of war relief that many subsequent performances were quickly scheduled. It made a lot of money for the war effort. Now, what's fascinating about the Vespers, other than the fact that it was composed in just 2 weeks in January and February of 1915, is that it is a culmination of the preceding 2 decades of interest in Russian sacred music, including Tchaikovsky's own setting of the all-night vigil, and you can hear similarities between Tchaikovsky's and Rachmaninoff's works, in particular the use of traditional chants. We'll talk about that more in just a second. However, Rachmaninoff's setting of the all-night vigil is much more complex in its use of harmony and tonality and the way the parts work together, polyphony as it is. Now, here's a list of the movements that you'll see in the all-night vigil. There are 15 movements, and what's particularly of interest is bearing in mind that Rachmaninoff was not particularly religious. He had listened to this music. Of course, he'd been exposed to it by his maternal grandmother, and he'd heard a lot of these melodies played on the bells of his native town, but he didn't really follow the traditional outline of the Vespers, which is why it's not actually a Vespers service. He took parts from different traditions and combined them in a way that no one had ever done before. So from the Orthodox tradition, we have 6 pieces right at the start, and those of you singing on SIC this week, Come Let Us Worship is the first one, and Rejoice, O Virgin is the 6th. So these are from the Orthodox tradition. But then you have matins here. You have a number of movements here from the matins, and then from the first hour service right at the end. And what you also have here is different chant styles, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the 3 that Rachmaninoff called upon were the Znameni chants, the Kiev chants, and the Greek chants, and all of them have different aspects that he wove together. Now, the ones that don't have a definition next to them were Rachmaninoff's own compositions. These ones that do have, Rachmaninoff used these styles and this particular chant and wove his own harmony around it. But the movements that he wrote himself were so close in style to these traditional chants that the composer himself called them conscious counterfeits or conscious copies. And what's glorious for those of us who know Rachmaninoff's music and love it is that every human emotion is encompassed within these works. I mean, it's praise, penitence, meditation, proclamation. It is an astonishing collection of works. Now, although the work was very well received and really seemed to set Rachmaninoff on a path of great success, unfortunately it was short-lived because the post-revolutionary Bolshevik authorities drove religious expression deep underground. The societies and the schools and the churches of which Rachmaninoff was a member were disbanded, and the vigil basically fell into obscurity for about 50 years. So obviously rather sad. Let's very quickly talk about some of the chants here. So the Znameni chant that I was talking about, this is perhaps the oldest form of chant that you'll hear in the Vespers. And this is an example of the so-called Stolp notation, which this is written in. And those of you that are followers of the deep dive will remember the use of neumes in medieval texts. Well, there's certainly an awful lot to say in common here. These are little figures that show notes and little passages. And fascinatingly, a number of these passages, these symbols, not only mean musical notes, but also have religious significance. There's one specific sign right at the beginning, which is called Little Dove, which represents two rising sounds, but also is a symbol of the Holy Ghost. So there you are. Now, the other forms that I mentioned is the Kievan chant, which was first developed in what is now Ukraine. In essence, a drastically simplified of the Znameni chant, but also includes homophony, so includes chords. And the Greek chant, which we saw on the list earlier on, is one of the liturgical chants of the church, obviously, and is characterized by syllabic structure, so the music moving syllabically with the words, and a symmetry of rhythm and phrase construction. Now, what we're going to do now, folks, is to listen to some of the Vespers. And just bearing in mind, as I've been saying this week on SIC, Rachmaninoff used all of his experience as an orchestral composer to compose for the choir. Rather than writing relatively banal four-part texture, he employs sometimes 8, 12, 16 parts to create an incredible blanket of support for these chants that weave throughout. The melodies tend to move by step, very much in keeping with the traditions of the Orthodox Church. And you know what is particularly moving, I think, is just the exquisite harmonies that he drapes around the chants to create this completely unique style of singing that really nobody had ever heard before. Now, let's have a little bit of the opening of the Vespers. Those of you, as I say, on SIC will recognize this. This is Priditye Poklonimся, Come, Let Us Worship. Now, there'll be a little bit of an introduction because I've got this video from YouTube. And so there's a little bit of a graphical introduction, but then you'll hear an Amen, an Amen, and then the opening of this wonderful Come, Let Us Worship, this call to a service. So here we are. Here's the opening of the Vespers. As I say, this isn't the Vespers. So I've already said the use of bell motifs in this movement is very, very prominent. And here you'll hear them again. Wonderful. Okay. So the Vespers themselves remained in Rachmaninoff's mind, despite the fact that he was forced to leave Russia by the Bolsheviks. He sought any opportunity he could to get a visa to take his family abroad. He was offered a tour in Scandinavia in the late teens, the 20th century, and he took it as quickly as he could to get his family out. And he subsequently fled to the USA, where he spent the rest of his days. And he reinvented himself as a concert pianist, one of the great virtuosos of the 20th century. Also, of course, as a conductor. But it's not a surprise that the sounds of his childhood, and in particular the Russian Orthodox Church, kept bringing him back, kept reminding him of his homeland. Towards the end of his life, he said that his two favourite compositions were the bells, which I've already mentioned, and the all-night vigil. and the fifth movement of the all-night vigil, which is where we're going to finish today. The Nunc Dimittis, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. He asked that this be sung at his own funeral. And so that's where we're going to leave today, everyone. An amazing composer whose work really, we're so lucky to have it. It was the result of great personal and emotional struggle on the part of an incredibly talented composer who suffered great tragedies in his life and overcame them to become one of the great melodic and harmonic writers of the 19th and 20th century, and really a composer. I can't imagine my life without Rachmaninoff's music in it. So let's finish today. I'm going to play the entire movement. This is from an incredible recording of the Vespers, which I do commend to all of you. This was recorded in the 80s by the USSR Ministry of Culture Choir. It is the finest recording of the Vespers in existence. Absolutely astonishing. So this is Nunc Dimittis from the Vespers, by Sergei Rachmaninoff, conducted and sung by the USSR Ministry of Culture Choir. I do hope you've enjoyed today's deep dive, everyone. We're back on Friday with Fun Friday, but I'm going to leave it with Rachmaninoff to close for today. Here we are. Well, there you are. That's it for today, everyone. Thank you so much for your lovely, lovely comments. I really hope you enjoyed it. It is beautiful. It is so sad, so moving, and so human, all of Rachmaninoff's music. So I'll see you on Friday for Fun Friday. Those of you on SIC, I'll be up for the tenors in about 10 minutes. I see it's Huyen's birthday today. Can we sing happy birthday for you on Friday when we're all together? But do enjoy your day. And everyone, have a great day. See you soon. All the best. Bye-bye.